A lonely birthday morning. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of a cramped one-bedroom apartment, casting a pale glow on the peeling wallpaper. The smell of dust and stale air lingered, as if the apartment itself had given up trying to be a home. Tom Parker, barely 8 years old, blinked awake in his bed, a mattress on the floor with a thin blanket thrown over it. His heartbeat quickened with excitement. Today was the day. His birthday. A grin spread across his face as he sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Maybe this year would be different. He had spent weeks counting down to this morning, marking each passing day with a bright blue crayon on the old calendar tacked to the wall. He had envisioned a special breakfast, maybe pancakes or at least toast with jelly. He imagined his mother singing "Happy Birthday" as she pulled out a surprise from behind her back. But as Tom stepped onto the cold wooden floor, the silence in the apartment felt heavier than usual. He tiptoed toward the kitchen, peeking around the doorway. His mother, Denise Parker, stood by the sink, wearing her faded blue diner uniform. Her blonde hair was tied back hastily, with loose strands falling around her tired face. Dark circles clung under her eyes, the weight of exhaustion making her shoulders slump. She didn't look up when Tom entered. Instead, she stared at the coffee pot, as if willing it to brew something stronger than caffeine. Tom hesitated. Maybe she's pretending. Maybe she's waiting for the perfect moment to surprise me. He took a deep breath. "Morning, Mom." Denise barely glanced up. "Morning, honey." Her voice was thick with fatigue as she reached for a chipped coffee mug, the one that said "World's Best Mom" in faded lettering. She took a long sip, still staring at nothing. Tom waited. She would say it any second now. She had to. The seconds stretched. Instead, she sighed and set her cup down with a quiet clink. "There's cereal in the cabinet, but we're almost out of milk. Try not to use too much." Tom's stomach twisted. No mention of his birthday. No balloons. No smile. Just cereal. His throat felt tight as he pulled open the cupboard. The nearly empty shelves held a half-crushed cereal box, a jar of peanut butter, and a single can of soup. He poured himself a bowl of plain cornflakes, drowning them in what little milk was left. He could already tell it was on the verge of turning sour. He forced himself to eat. His mother was busy checking her phone, typing quickly, her fingers tapping the screen in an almost frantic rhythm. "Mom." His voice was quiet. "Mem." He swallowed hard. "Just ask. Just remind her." But as she sighed again, rubbing her forehead, he lost his nerve. She forgot. Or maybe she just didn't care. A lump formed in his throat, but he forced himself to take another spoonful of cereal, even as his stomach churned. Denise grabbed her purse from the counter, fishing out her car keys. "I have a double shift today, so I won't be home until late." Tom dropped his spoon. "Late. On my birthday." She walked toward the door, glancing at her phone again. Then, as if finally remembering she had a son, she ruffled his hair half-heartedly. "Be good at school, okay?" The door clicked shut behind her before he could say another word. The silence that followed was deafening. The longest school day. The halls of Lincoln Elementary buzzed with energy as students filed in, chatting about their weekend plans and trading snacks from their lunches. Tom moved through the crowd like a ghost, unnoticed and unseen. Maybe someone here would remember. Mrs. Hathaway, his third-grade teacher, always wrote the birthdays on the board. Maybe she had a cupcake for him, like she did for other kids. He sat at his desk, waiting. But when Mrs. Hathaway stepped in, she didn't look at him any differently. She set down her books, glanced at the board, and started writing math problems. No birthday mention. No special star next to his name. Tom's fingers curled into a fist under his desk. At lunchtime, he picked at the squashed peanut butter sandwich he had packed himself that morning. He barely took 2 bites before wrapping it back up. Across the table, a group of girls giggled. "We're having my birthday at the arcade this weekend," one of them announced. "There's going to be pizza and laser tag." It's going to be awesome. Tom stared down at his lunch, trying to keep his face neutral. Why couldn't I have something like that? Kevin, his best friend, sat down beside him. Tom, my birthday's next week. My mom's letting me invite 15 kids to my party. There's going to be a superhero bounce house and cake and everything. Tom forced a smile. That's cool. Kevin frowned, noticing his lack of enthusiasm. Wait, isn't your birthday soon too? Tom hesitated, then nodded. Kevin brightened. Awesome. What are you doing for it? Tom hesitated again, his face burning. He could lie. Say something cool. But instead, he shrugged. Nothing, really. Kevin blinked. Nothing. Tom kept his eyes down, pretending his peanut butter sandwich was the most interesting thing in the world. Maybe next year, he muttered. Kevin hesitated but didn't push. The rest of the day crawled by. The forgotten pickup. The final bell rang, releasing students into the schoolyard. Parents and caregivers lined the curb, calling out names, scooping their children into hugs, handing them after-school snacks. Tom stood on the sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He searched the crowd, eyes scanning for the familiar blue waitress uniform. Cars came and went. One by one, his classmates disappeared. The sun dipped lower. The school doors locked behind him. The wind picked up, nipping at his thin jacket. Still, no one came. He sat on the cold concrete steps, hugging his knees to his chest. His breath trembled. His mother wasn't coming. Again. A single tear escaped down his cheek, but he wiped it away quickly. Big boys don't cry. But then, the distant wail of sirens. Flashing red and blue lights. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb. The driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, his uniform neat, his presence commanding yet calm. Officer Daniel Grayson. Tom stared as the officer approached, his boots crunching on the pavement. "Hey there, kid," the officer said, his voice steady and warm. "What are you still doing here?" Tom swallowed hard, his small fingers gripping the straps of his backpack. I'm waiting for my mom," he whispered. Officer Grayson's expression softened as he glanced at the now empty parking lot. He crouched to eye level with Tom, his weathered face kind. "Has she ever been this late before?" Tom nodded slowly. The officer studied him for a long moment. "All right, buddy," he finally said. "Why don't we sit inside where it's warm? And we'll figure this out together." Tom hesitated, but the warmth in Officer Grayson's voice, so different from the indifference he was used to, made him nod. As he followed the officer inside, he had no idea that this moment would change everything. A stranger's kindness. Tom followed Officer Grayson into the school's dimly lit office, his small frame barely making a sound against the tile floor. The warmth of the room hit him instantly, a stark contrast to the evening chill outside. He hugged his backpack tighter to his chest, his fingers gripping the straps so hard that his knuckles turned white. Miss Jensen, the school's secretary, was still at her desk, her sharp eyes softening as she looked at Tom. She had been the one to call the police when she realized no one had come for him. She gave Officer Grayson a knowing glance before standing up and handing Tom a small cup of hot chocolate from the teacher's lounge. "Drink up, sweetheart," she said gently, patting his shoulder. "It's getting cold out there." Tom nodded mutely, taking the cup with both hands. The warmth seeped through his fingers, but he didn't take a sip right away. Instead, he watched as Officer Grayson lowered himself into the chair across from him, pulling out a small notepad and pen from his pocket. "So, Tom," the officer started, his voice calm and even, "can you tell me where your mom usually picks you up?" Tom shifted in his seat. He had never been alone with a police officer before, and it made him nervous. He thought about lying, about saying his mother was just running late. But something about Officer Grayson's steady gaze made him feel like he didn't have to pretend. She usually picks me up right here," Tom said softly. "But sometimes she forgets." Grayson's eyebrows twitched. but he didn't say anything. Instead, he jotted something down in his notepad. "What about your dad?" he asked. Tom shook his head. "I don't have one." Silence stretched between them for a few seconds before Grayson spoke again. "Has she ever forgotten to pick you up this late before?" Tom hesitated. He didn't want to get his mother in trouble. He knew she worked hard. But this wasn't the first time he'd been left waiting. He bit his lip and nodded. Grayson sighed, tapping his pen against the notepad. Then he turned to Miss Jensen. "Have you been able to reach his mother?" She shook her head. "Her phone goes straight to voicemail." Grayson muttered something under his breath, then stood up. "All right, Tom. I'm going to try calling her again, okay? Just sit tight." Tom nodded, his fingers tightening around the cup of hot chocolate. He watched as Officer Grayson stepped outside the office, his phone pressed to his ear. Tom couldn't hear what he was saying, but he could tell by the set of the officer's shoulders that it wasn't good news. A few minutes later, Grayson walked back inside, his jaw clenched. No answer. Miss Jensen's mouth tightened. "Should we call child services?" The words sent a wave of panic through Tom. He had heard about kids getting taken away. Kids who didn't have parents that could take care of them. Kids like me. "No," he blurted out. "She's coming. She wouldn't just." His voice cracked. Grayson knelt down in front of him. Hey, I'm not trying to take you away from your mom, kid. I just want to make sure you're safe." Tom sniffed, his throat feeling tight. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Grayson exchanged another glance with Miss Jensen before straightening up. "Okay, here's what we're gonna do," he said. "I'm going to take you somewhere to eat, and while we're there, I'll keep trying to reach your mom. Sound good?" Tom hesitated, glancing at Miss Jensen. She gave him a reassuring nod. "Go on, sweetheart. Officer Grayson will take care of you." Tom still wasn't sure, but his stomach growled loudly, betraying him. He ducked his head, embarrassed. Grayson chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes." A meal with a stranger. Tom sat in the front seat of Officer Grayson's police cruiser, the seatbelt a little too big for him. He stared out the window, his breath fogging up the glass as the city lights whizzed past. He had never ridden in a police car before. It felt weird. They pulled into the parking lot of a small diner. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, casting a warm glow over the sidewalk. Inside, the smell of grilled burgers and fries wrapped around Tom like a blanket, making his empty stomach rumble again. A waitress with gray hair and kind eyes smiled when she saw them walk in. "Evening, Officer Grayson. What's the occasion?" "Just grabbing some food for my new friend here," Grayson said, nodding toward Tom. Tom slid into the booth, suddenly feeling out of place. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be at home, eating dinner with his mom, if she even remembered. The waitress handed them menus, but Tom barely glanced at his before Grayson spoke up. "We'll take 2 cheeseburgers, fries, and a chocolate milkshake." Tom's eyes widened. A milkshake. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had one. Grayson must have noticed his surprise because he smirked. "Trust me, kid. They make the best shakes here." When the food arrived, Tom hesitated for only a second before digging in. The burger was warm and juicy, and the fries were perfectly crispy. He ate quickly, almost afraid it would disappear if he didn't finish fast enough. Grayson watched him, his expression unreadable. "You always eat this fast?" he asked. Tom slowed down, his cheeks burning. "Sorry," he mumbled. Grayson shook his head. "Don't apologize. Just means you were hungry." Tom chewed the last of his burger in silence. His stomach was full, but his chest felt tight. "She really forgot, didn't she?" he finally said. Grayson exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Looks that way." Tom stared at his milkshake, watching as the whipped cream melted into the chocolate. "I don't think she meant to." Grayson was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Maybe not." The words hung between them. Tom didn't know what else to say. He didn't want to think about what this meant. The truth uncovered. By the time they left the diner, it was late. The streets were mostly empty, the distant hum of cars filling the quiet night air. Grayson led Tom back to the cruiser and buckled him in. "All right, kid. Let's try one more time to find your mom." They drove in silence for a while before Grayson pulled into the parking lot of an old apartment complex. Tom's stomach sank as soon as he saw it. Their building looked even worse in the dim streetlights, the paint peeling, the stairwell dark and uninviting. Grayson parked and turned to him. "This where you live?" Tom nodded. But when they reached the door to his apartment, something was wrong. The locks had been changed. A bright invitation notice was taped to the door. Tom's breath hitched. "No," he whispered, his small hands reaching for the paper, as if tearing it down would make it untrue. Grayson stepped forward, his face darkening as he read the notice. Evicted. His mother was gone. Tom backed up, shaking his head. She wouldn't just leave me." But the empty hallway told a different story. His home was gone. Tears blurred his vision as the truth crashed down on him. His mom wasn't coming back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. And for the first time, as Officer Grayson crouched down beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder, Tom let himself cry. The choice that changes everything. The fluorescent light from the hallway buzzed softly above Tom's head as he stared at the eviction notice taped to the door of his apartment. His small hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers barely brushing the edge of the paper. "Eviction notice. Premises must be vacated immediately. Failure to comply may result in legal action." The words blurred together, his vision swimming. His legs felt weak beneath him. Gone. His mother was gone. His stomach twisted in knots, and a heavy lump formed in his throat. The weight of it pressed down on his chest until it felt like he could barely breathe. Behind him, Officer Daniel Grayson exhaled, his broad shoulders stiff as he took in the scene. His veteran instincts had told him something was wrong from the start. But this was worse than he expected. Tom's voice came out small and cracked. She wouldn't leave me." Grayson crouched down beside him, resting a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Kid," he said softly, "this doesn't mean she left you on purpose." Tom turned to look at him, eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears. "Then where is she?" Grayson had no answer. The hallway was empty, the apartment silent behind that locked door. There were no bags left behind, no clue as to where Denise Parker had gone. Just this notice. A cold, impersonal piece of paper that told Tom his life as he knew it had just ended. Grayson let out a slow breath. He had seen a lot of things in his years on the force. Broken homes, desperate parents, kids caught in the middle of impossible situations. But there was something about this kid, something in the way he waited, so full of hope, that made this different. The officer's grip on Tom's shoulder firmed. "All right, listen to me. We'll find her. But first, you're coming with me." Tom blinked at him. "Where?" "Someplace safe." "But what if she comes back?" His voice wavered. "What if she's looking for me right now?" Grayson hesitated. The kid still believed in her, still wanted to hold on. But a mother who cared wouldn't have left her kid stranded outside a school. "She'll know where to find you," Grayson finally said. "But right now, you need food, a warm bed, and someone looking out for you." Tom's shoulders slumped, the last fight leaving his small body. He didn't have a choice, because at that moment, Officer Grayson was all he had left. A cop's house, a stranger's home. The ride to Grayson's house was quiet. Tom sat in the passenger seat of the police cruiser, staring out the window, his face illuminated by passing streetlights. The weight of everything that had happened pressed against his chest like a rock. He had no home, no idea where his mother was, and now he was being taken to a stranger's house. When the car pulled into a quiet neighborhood, Tom barely reacted. The house they stopped in front of was small but neat, the porch light casting a warm glow on the wooden steps. A real house, with a yard, a driveway, a mailbox that wasn't broken. Grayson killed the engine and looked over at the boy, who still hadn't spoken. "Come on, kid." Tom followed him up the steps, his shoes scraping against the wooden planks. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and old books, a little different from the faint scent of cigarette smoke and cheap perfume that clung to their old apartment. It was warm. Lived in. Grayson flipped on a lamp, its soft glow revealing a modest living room. A well-worn couch, a coffee table stacked with books, and a TV that looked a little too old to be considered fancy. "You hungry?" Grayson asked, already heading toward the kitchen. Tom hesitated before nodding. He was always hungry. A few minutes later, he was sitting at the small dining table with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. It wasn't much, but it was warm and regal, not just another sandwich slapped together in a rush. Grayson sat across from him, arms crossed, watching as Tom ate like he was afraid the food would disappear. After a while, the officer leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You ever stayed somewhere other than home before?" Tom shook his head. "Just at my friend Kevin's once. But not like this." Grayson nodded. "I'll make some calls in the morning. Try to track down your mom." Tom swallowed hard, gripping his fork a little tighter. "She's coming back." Grayson didn't say anything. After they ate, he showed Tom the guest room. It was small, with plain blue walls, and a single bed covered in a soft-looking quilt. A small desk sat in the corner, and a window overlooked the backyard. Tom stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. This wasn't his home. "I know it's not much," Grayson said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but it's yours for now." Tom stepped inside hesitantly, his fingers brushing over the quilt. It was soft, softer than anything he'd had in years. "You need anything, kid?" Tom hesitated before looking up. "Can you leave the door open?" Grayson's chest tightened. "Yeah," he said. "Of course." And for the first time since that long, lonely wait outside the school, Tom slept in a real bed, under a real roof, feeling something close to safe. A hard truth. The next morning, Tom sat at the kitchen table, watching as Grayson made phone call after phone call. His gut clenched every time the officer shook his head. "She's not at her old job," Grayson muttered after another failed call. "Didn't even leave a forwarding address." Tom pressed his lips together. "She left. She really left." But then, Grayson suddenly stiffened, his expression darkening. Tom sat up straighter. What is it?" Grayson exhaled through his nose, gripping his phone a little tighter. "I just found her car." Tom's heart leaped. "Where?" But the look on the officer's face made his stomach twist. An abandoned lot across town. Empty. The air seemed to leave the room. Tom shook his head. That doesn't mean anything." Grayson ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. This wasn't the first time he'd seen a situation like this. A struggling parent, too many bills, a moment of desperation. Some came back. Some didn't. But Tom wasn't just some kid in a file. And he refused to let this be another case that ended the wrong way. He met Tom's wide, fearful eyes and made a decision. "We're gonna find her," Grayson said, voice steady. "And until then, you're sticking with me." Tom swallowed hard. What if she doesn't want me? Grayson's jaw clenched. "She's your mom, kid. We're gonna hope for the best." But as he looked at the abandoned car on the screen in front of him, something told him this wasn't going to have an easy ending. And whether Denise Parker returned or not, one thing was clear. Tom needed someone to fight for him. And for the first time in 30 years on the force, Grayson knew this wasn't just a job anymore. It was personal. The search for answers. The morning sun peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across Officer Daniel Grayson's quiet neighborhood. The coffee on his kitchen counter had grown cold, forgotten in the whirlwind of calls and plans for the day. Tom was still asleep in the guest room, tucked under the warm quilt, his face peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. But Grayson couldn't rest. He paced in the small kitchen, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. The truth about Denise Parker weighed on him heavily. She was a mother, someone trying, however imperfectly, to keep it together in a world that offered little support. But what happened to her? The unanswered questions gnawed at him. Tom deserved better. He deserved answers. Grayson grabbed his phone and dialed a number from memory. The dial tone echoed in the quiet kitchen before the familiar voice on the other end answered. Officer Grayson. Mike, I need a favor, Grayson said, his voice calm but purposeful. I need to find out where Denise Parker went after she got evicted. Someone's got to know where she's at. Mike, a fellow officer and Grayson's partner for years, exhaled slowly. I've got a few leads I can follow up on. You know this doesn't look good, right? I know, but I don't care about the paperwork right now. Just get me the information. Mike hesitated for a second. All right, I'll see what I can do. Keep me updated. Grayson hung up the phone and took a deep breath. The air outside the window was crisp, the early morning chill still hanging in the air. He glanced down the hallway toward the guest room door. Tom. The boy had been through more in the past 24 hours than most kids should experience in a lifetime. His whole world had been turned upside down, lost in the space between a mother who had vanished and a stranger who was now the only source of comfort. Grayson had to find her. The search begins. It didn't take long for the leads to come in. The first was from a neighbor who had seen Denise loading up her car early that morning, her old Honda Civic packed with bags and boxes. The neighbor hadn't recognized the urgency in her movements, only noting that she'd driven off in a hurry. Grayson's heart sank. Was this a last-minute scramble, or was something more going on? He'd seen enough desperation in people's eyes to know that the line between survival and breakdown was razor thin. The second lead took him to a local shelter that catered to homeless families. Grayson walked into the small building, its walls lined with donated blankets and jackets. The volunteer behind the counter glanced up at him, her face weary. Can I help you, officer? I'm looking for a woman named Denise Parker. She came through here, maybe yesterday. The volunteer shook her head. We haven't seen anyone by that name. Sorry. Grayson's stomach churned. Another dead end. But he wasn't going to stop. He couldn't. A breakthrough. A few hours later, Grayson found himself at a rundown motel on the edge of town. The place had a reputation for being a haven for those down on their luck, the kind of place where people disappeared into the shadows and where the desperate sought shelter for a night or two before moving on. He entered the small office and approached the front desk. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and tired eyes, looked up at him. What can I do for you, officer? I'm looking for a woman named Denise Parker. She checked in recently. The clerk tapped at his computer, scrolling through a list of names. His fingers paused. Parker. Yeah, she was here last night. But the clerk hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. I think she left in the middle of the night. Didn't even pay for the room. Took off like she was running from something. Grayson's pulse quickened. Did you see where she went? Grayson asked, trying to keep his tone casual. The clerk shook his head. She was gone by the time I got here this morning. I don't know, man. She just seemed off. Grayson exhaled. Another dead end, but something about the clerk's words stuck with him. Running from something. Where had she gone? A glimmer of hope. At this point, Grayson was running on little sleep and even less optimism. He had one last place to check, a local bar where Denise had occasionally worked as a waitress before things started going south. He had been to the bar a few times, and though Denise had always kept to herself, there was something familiar about the place. Maybe someone would know where she had gone. The bar smelled of stale beer and fried food. The low hum of a jukebox played in the background, and a couple of patrons sat at the counter, nursing beers and talking in low voices. Grayson walked in, scanning the room for the bartender. It didn't take long. The bartender, a tall man with a thick mustache and dark tattoos snaking up his arms, looked up as Grayson approached. Can I help you, officer? He asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. I'm looking for a woman named Denise Parker. She used to work here. The bartender nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he wiped down the counter. Yeah, I remember her. She quit about 2 days ago. Didn't say much. Just handed me her apron, said she had to leave town. And that was it. Grayson leaned forward. Do you know where she went? Anything at all? The bartender scratched his chin, thinking. She didn't say where, but she mentioned something about an old friend. A woman. Someplace up north. She said she'd be back for her shift. But I don't know. Grayson's heart skipped a beat. Up north. Was this the answer he'd been looking for? Do you have an address or a name? Grayson asked. The bartender's eyes flickered with hesitation. No, I don't. Sorry. She wasn't exactly chatty before she left. Just a lot of I gotta go, and I'll figure things out. Grayson stood up straight, his mind racing. Up north. That could mean anything. But it was the first solid lead he'd gotten all day. A ride north. With the information he had, Grayson decided it was time to take a chance. He loaded up his cruiser and drove north, toward the small towns and outlying areas that barely made a blip on the map. The drive stretched on for hours, the silence inside the car growing heavier with each passing mile. Tom, for the first time in hours, had drifted off to sleep in the back seat. Grayson glanced back at him every now and then, his thoughts torn between finding Denise and making sure the boy didn't wake up to a world that had failed him. By the time Grayson reached the small weathered town that was rumored to be the last place Denise had been, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. He parked his car in front of a dusty diner and stepped out, scanning the area for anything familiar. Inside, the smell of fried food and coffee lingered in the air. A few locals sat at the counter, exchanging small talk. But there was one woman sitting in the back booth, her face turned toward the window, deep in thought. Grayson's heart skipped a beat. It was her, Denise Parker. The confrontation. Grayson walked over to the booth, his boots heavy against the floor. He paused just short of her table, watching as Denise took a long sip from her cup of coffee. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her once bright blue waitress uniform was now worn and faded. She didn't see him at first. When she finally looked up, her eyes widened in surprise. Recognition flashed across her face, but before she could say anything, Grayson spoke. Denise. Her face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I've been looking for you. Grayson's voice was steady but firm. Tom's worried about you. Denise's eyes flickered to the door, then back to Grayson. He's okay, isn't he? Grayson nodded slowly. He's fine. But you need to tell me what's going on. Her shoulders slumped. I was trying to get away. Trying to fix things. She trailed off, staring at her hands as they fidgeted in her lap. Fix things how? Grayson asked, his voice softening slightly. I couldn't keep up with the bills. The eviction. It was all too much. I thought if I just left, things would be easier for him. I didn't want him to see me fail anymore. Grayson's heart broke as he listened to her voice crack. Denise, you're not failing him. You're just trying to survive. You need to go back. He's waiting for you. Denise looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes. I can't go back. I don't have anything left. Grayson took a step closer. You have your son. That's all you need. She wiped a tear from her cheek. I don't know how to make things right. Grayson reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. I'll help you. You don't have to do this alone. Denise sat in the diner booth, her hands still trembling as she wiped at her eyes. Grayson's words settled around her like a blanket, both comforting and suffocating at the same time. She had been running for so long, hiding from her failures, from the weight of her mistakes. But as the officer stood before her, his steady gaze unwavering, she realized she couldn't outrun it anymore. She couldn't outrun him. I don't know where to go from here, she whispered, her voice barely audible against the hum of the diner. I thought maybe if I just left for a while, if I could sort myself out, I could come back and fix things. Maybe he'd have a better life without me dragging him down. Grayson studied her for a moment. He had heard this story 100 times in his career, but something about Denise's resignation, the hollow defeat in her voice, made it different. She wasn't a criminal on the run. She was a mother, trying, and failing, to hold on to a life that had slipped away from her. She was someone who had run out of options. "You don't have to do this alone, Denise," Grayson said softly, his voice steady, even though he could feel the pull of the situation tugging at his heart. "We'll figure this out. You don't have to keep hiding. You've got someone who cares now. Tom needs you, and you need him too." Her eyes locked on his, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. The bustling chatter of the diner, the clinking of dishes, the distant rumble of traffic, all of it seemed far away. All that remained was her and him, two people whose lives had collided in a way neither could have anticipated. "I didn't want him to see me like this," Denise murmured, her voice trembling. "I didn't want him to know I can't fix anything, that I can't give him the life he deserves." "You're not perfect," Grayson said quietly. "Nobody is, but you're his mother, and you've given him everything you've got. That counts for something. It's not too late to go back and make things right." She looked down at her hands, wringing them in her lap. Grayson could see the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, suffocating her hope. But he could also see something else, the faintest flicker of relief. She was tired. Tired of running. Tired of pretending. Grayson stepped back and sat across from her, his eyes never leaving hers. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. He could sense the internal battle raging inside of her, the fear of failure, the fear of what would happen if she tried and didn't succeed. But he also knew one thing with certainty: Denise had more fight in her than she realized. The drive home. The drive back was quieter than Grayson had anticipated. Denise sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out the window. The miles stretched out between them, each one a reminder of what had been lost and what could still be regained. Grayson kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but think about Tom. The boy had been through more than any child should ever experience. Left outside his school, forgotten by the one person who should have been there for him. But now he was on his way back to a new home, a new chance. A chance to heal, to be a kid again. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. And so was Denise. She had agreed to go back. She had agreed to try again. And while Grayson knew it wasn't going to be easy, he also knew that this was the first step toward rebuilding everything they had lost. "Do you think he'll forgive me?" Denise's voice broke the silence, soft and tentative. Grayson glanced over at her, his expression serious. "He's already forgiven you. Kids don't hold grudges like adults do. All he wants is to know that you're there, that you're not giving up on him." Denise swallowed, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "I haven't given up on him, but I'm scared. I'm scared of failing him again." Grayson nodded. "I get it. You don't want to be the kind of mother who lets her kid down. But sometimes just showing up is all it takes. And you've done that." Denise remained silent, her face pensive. For the first time, she didn't seem as defeated as before. Maybe the weight of her guilt would never truly lift, but there was a new sense of hope flickering inside her. She was on her way back. She was going to make things right. Back to the start. The cruiser rolled up in front of the modest apartment building where Tom was waiting. The lights were dim in the parking lot, but Grayson could see the small figure standing by the steps, looking out for any sign of his mother. Tom's face lit up when he saw the cruiser pull up. He stood up straighter, his eyes scanning the vehicle, and then, when he saw Grayson step out, he bounded toward him with that same wide-eyed enthusiasm. "Is she here? Is she coming back?" Tom asked, his voice full of hope. Grayson stepped aside, and Denise emerged from the cruiser. Tom froze for a moment, his eyes searching her face. His mother looked different, tired, yes, but there was something else there too. Determination. She smiled at him, her lips trembling. "Mom," Tom whispered, taking a cautious step forward. Denise's throat tightened. "I'm sorry I was gone for so long, baby. I didn't mean to leave you. But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Tom's face transformed in an instant. The worry melted away, replaced by the pure, innocent joy of seeing his mother again. He threw his arms around her waist, his small frame trembling against hers. "I knew you'd come back," he whispered, his voice muffled against her. "I knew you would." Denise closed her eyes, her own tears slipping down her cheeks as she held him close. It wasn't perfect. Their life was still in shambles. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. They were together again. Grayson watched them from a distance, his heart heavy but full. He had done what he could. He had helped. He had been the one to bring them back together, to give them a shot at starting over. But now, it was up to them. It was up to them to rebuild, to find a way to make their broken pieces fit together again. And as he turned and walked back to his cruiser, he knew that sometimes helping others meant more than just doing the job. Sometimes it meant being part of something that changed lives. And he'd just helped this family find their way back to one another. A new beginning. The morning after Denise's return was quiet. The soft light of dawn crept through the small apartment window, casting long shadows across the worn furniture. Tom was still asleep, curled up in his bed, his face peaceful and free from the worry that had plagued him for days. The night before had been full of emotions, but now the air in the apartment felt a little lighter. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Denise sat at the small kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. She looked out the window, staring blankly at the empty parking lot below. Her fingers traced the edge of her mug as she thought about everything that had led her here. The choices she'd made, the mistakes, the hours spent running away from the truth. But there was no more running. She had made it back, and now she had to make it right. She could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing against her chest, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone in it. Grayson's words had resonated deeply with her the night before. Just showing up was enough. But now she had to show up every day. She needed to be present. For herself, for Tom, for the future they were both trying to rebuild. The events of the last few days had shifted something in her. She'd realized that survival wasn't about pushing through alone. It was about accepting help, about leaning on others when the burden became too heavy to carry alone. The front door creaked open, breaking her reverie. Denise turned to see Tom standing in the doorway, his hair messy from sleep, his eyes bright with excitement. "Mom," he said, his voice full of hope, "I made you something." Denise raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You did? What is it, sweetheart?" Tom bounded toward the kitchen table, holding up a crayon drawing with both hands. It was a picture of their apartment, their home, with the sun shining above, and the words "Welcome Home, Mom" written in bold, colorful letters. Denise felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at the drawing. She could feel the warmth of his love in the simple lines, in the way he had colored outside the lines with abandon, as though he had made this for her, with no care for perfection, just pure, unfiltered joy. "You like it?" Tom asked, his eyes searching hers. Denise swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I love it, baby. Thank you." Tom grinned, and Denise took the picture from him, setting it on the table. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close for a hug. "You've made me the happiest mom in the world," she whispered. As she held him, she realized that for the first time in a long while, she was exactly where she needed to be. There would be challenges ahead. They had so much to rebuild, but as long as they had each other, Denise knew they could face anything. The morning after. Later that morning, Officer Grayson stopped by the apartment. He had called ahead, giving Denise and Tom time to settle into their new routine. Grayson had become more than just an officer to them. He had become a quiet protector, a guide through the chaos of their lives. When he knocked on the door, Tom ran to answer it, his eyes bright as he opened it wide. "It's Officer Grayson," he said, grinning. Grayson smiled down at him, ruffling his hair. "Hey, buddy. How's it going?" Tom jumped up and down, his excitement bubbling over. "Mom's home. She came back, and I made her a picture. Look." He grabbed the crayon drawing from the kitchen table and handed it to Grayson. The officer took it from him, his smile softening as he looked at the simple drawing. "This is amazing, Tom," Grayson said. "I'm proud of you." Tom beamed. Denise stepped into the doorway, watching the scene unfold. It wasn't lost on her just how different things felt this morning compared to the day before. The apartment, though small and still in need of repairs, felt like a home for the first time. "Thanks for coming by, officer," Denise said, her voice steady but full of gratitude. Grayson nodded. "Of course. I just wanted to check in, see how things were going. How's everything?" Denise hesitated before answering. It's been a tough few days, but we're getting there." She looked over at Tom, who was now bouncing from foot to foot, unable to sit still. "I'm ready to face it all now. Ready to do better for him." Grayson's eyes softened. "You're already doing better. Don't forget that." Denise nodded, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't felt seen in a long time, at least, not in a way that made her feel worthy. But Grayson's words, the quiet support he had offered, made her feel like there was a path forward. "Well, I'll leave you to it," Grayson said, giving her a small nod. "But I'll be around if you need anything." As he turned to leave, Tom looked up at him. "Officer Grayson." Grayson paused. "Can we go to the park? Mom said it's okay. You can come too." Tom's enthusiasm was infectious. Grayson chuckled softly. "Maybe next time, kid. I've got work to do. But keep that drawing safe, all right?" Tom grinned. "I will. Thanks, officer." Grayson gave a small wave before heading back to his car. Denise watched him leave, feeling a mix of gratitude and awe. There was something about how people like Grayson showed up for others that made her believe, just a little, that she could start over. Maybe this time, things could be different. Maybe she didn't have to do it all alone. Taking responsibility. The next few days were spent in a flurry of action. Denise had reached out to local job agencies and applied for anything that would help her get back on her feet. It wasn't much, just a few leads here and there, but it was progress. She began cleaning the apartment, sorting through the pile of bills that had stacked up, and checking in with people who might be able to offer help. Tom had taken up a new routine as well. He started reading more, practicing his spelling, and even trying to teach himself how to draw. He was determined to make things better. Denise knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready for the challenge. Every time she looked at Tom, she was reminded of why she had to try. At night, after Tom had gone to bed, Denise would sit alone in the kitchen, going over her bills, making a budget, trying to figure out how to stretch what little they had. She often found herself staring at the clock, the hours slipping by as she tried to make sense of everything. It was hard, but it was manageable. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. A new purpose. One afternoon, about a week after they'd settled back into the apartment, there was a knock at the door. Denise opened it to find Grayson standing there, holding a small envelope. "Hi, Denise," he said, his voice casual but warm. "I thought you might want to see something." He handed her the envelope, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. She opened it carefully. Inside was a small check. It wasn't a large sum, but it was enough to make a difference. The note attached to it read, "For Tom's birthday party." Denise felt her breath catch in her chest as she read the note. It wasn't a handout, but an act of kindness, something that meant more than the money itself. This is from you?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Grayson nodded. "I'm not here to fix everything for you, Denise, but sometimes a little goes a long way." Tears welled in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. He was still helping. She had thought it was over, that she had to figure it all out alone. But here was Grayson, once again showing up when she needed him the most. You don't have to. Denise started to protest, but Grayson cut her off. No, you don't understand, he said, his voice softer now. It's not about me doing this for you. It's about you doing it for yourself, and for Tom. He placed a hand on her shoulder. You've got a lot to offer, and don't you forget it. Denise wiped away the tears that had slipped down her cheek, feeling something inside her shift. For the first time, she didn't feel lost. She felt found. And with that, Denise made a promise to herself. She would continue to fight. For Tom. For them. For their new beginning. Building a new life. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Denise awoke the next morning, the faint light filtering through the thin curtains of the small apartment. She lay still for a moment, her eyes open but not fully seeing the room around her. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant honking of a car outside. Her life felt different now. Everything had changed in the past week. It wasn't just the place she and Tom were now calling home. It was the way she looked at her future. The weight of the uncertainty that had pressed down on her shoulders for months seemed lighter. She still had a long way to go. She had to figure out the bills, find a stable job, and rebuild the trust between herself and Tom. But there was something in the air now, something she hadn't felt before. Hope. Denise pushed the thin blanket aside and stood up. She stretched, the familiar ache in her muscles from stress and lack of sleep still present, but it didn't feel quite as suffocating anymore. Tom had already been up for a while. She could hear the sound of his sneakers scuffing against the floor and his voice echoing from the kitchen. He was trying to make breakfast again, the way he had done so many mornings before, excited and full of determination, even if his attempts were far from perfect. "Good morning, baby," Denise called as she walked into the kitchen. Tom looked up from his seat at the kitchen table, a grin lighting up his face. He was holding a piece of toast in one hand, the other clumsily spreading peanut butter over it. The toast, of course, was a little burnt on one side, but the effort in his eyes was unmistakable. "I made breakfast," he declared proudly, despite the unevenly spread peanut butter. Denise's heart warmed. "Looks delicious," she said with a wink. "Let me help." She moved toward him, gently taking the knife from his hand. "I'm getting better, right, Mom?" Tom asked, his eyes wide with hope. "You're doing great, sweetheart." She smiled and kissed the top of his head, feeling the weight of everything they had been through in the past week melt away for just a moment. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It had to be. New beginnings and small victories. The next few days passed in a blur of effort. Denise spent her mornings at the local job agency, filling out applications and making phone calls. Some days, the responses were positive, but more often, they were just polite rejections. Still, she pressed on. She had Tom to think about now. She couldn't afford to let herself be discouraged. When she wasn't working on applications, she spent time with Tom. She helped him with his reading and math homework, listening patiently as he stuttered over new words, and cheered when he finally mastered something he had been struggling with. They spent afternoons at the small park down the street, the two of them running around, laughing and playing until they were both out of breath. Grayson had continued to check in on them, dropping by with food, supplies, or just to chat. Denise never quite got used to his quiet kindness, his willingness to show up when things got difficult. Sometimes he would bring a small toy for Tom or take him out for ice cream. It was clear that Grayson had become a constant in their lives, and in many ways, he was the reason they hadn't fallen completely apart. One afternoon, as Grayson sat across from Denise at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, she found herself talking to him more openly than she had before. "You know, when I first came back to town, I was terrified. Terrified of seeing Tom. Terrified of facing the reality of everything that had happened." She paused, her eyes dropping to her hands. "I don't know how I got so lost." Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You weren't lost, Denise. You were just stuck. That happens sometimes. The important thing is, you've found a way out." Denise's eyes flickered up, meeting his gaze. I'm scared, though. I don't know how to fix everything. I don't know how to make this work." Grayson set his cup down carefully, his voice steady. "It's not about fixing everything. It's about making sure you don't stop trying. You've already made the hardest choice by coming back. Now you just keep going, one step at a time." She nodded slowly, taking the deep breath. She had spent so many years hiding from the truth, trying to make it all work on her own, thinking she could handle it. But now she was finally learning that sometimes accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of strength. Facing the future together. Days turned into weeks, and little by little, things began to feel more settled. Denise had landed a part-time job as a waitress at a small diner down the street. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover some of the bills. She still had a long way to go, but every day brought a new opportunity to make things better. Tom continued to thrive. His schoolwork improved, and he became more confident in himself with each passing day. Denise couldn't help but marvel at his resilience. Despite everything he had been through, despite the fear and uncertainty, Tom had managed to hold on to his joy. And every night, when the day came to a close, Denise would sit with him on the couch, her arm around his shoulders, feeling the deep sense of gratitude for everything they had. One evening after dinner, Grayson came by to check in on them. Denise had made spaghetti that night, and Tom was animatedly recounting how he had gotten the highest score on his math quiz at school. It was the first time in a long while that they felt like a family again, a real family. "Mom, can I show Officer Grayson my new math book?" Tom asked eagerly, looking up at her. Denise nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Tom grabbed the book and hurried over to Grayson, practically jumping with excitement. "I got a new math book. And look, I can do multiplication now." Tom showed him proudly. Grayson took the book, flipping through it and smiling. "You're doing great, Tom," Grayson said with a warm smile. Denise watched the scene unfold in front of her, the smile on her face growing. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the weight of guilt pressing down on her. She wasn't perfect, but she was there for Tom, for herself. And that, she realized, was enough. A new kind of family. As the weeks passed, Denise and Tom's relationship grew stronger. There were still challenges, of course. They didn't have everything figured out, but they had each other. And that was a foundation to build on. One evening, as Denise was tucking Tom into bed, he looked up at her with a serious expression. "Mom," he said softly, Do you think we'll ever be happy again?" Denise's heart ached at the question. She sat down beside him, smoothing the hair from his forehead. "I think we're already happy, sweetheart," she said quietly. "We've got each other, and that's all we need." Tom smiled, his eyes closing as he snuggled deeper into his blankets. "I love you, Mom." Denise smiled, her heart full. "I love you too, baby." And in that moment, with the weight of everything they had been through and the uncertainty of the future still looming, Denise realized something. She didn't need to know everything or have all the answers. What mattered was that they were together. They were a family. And no matter what came next, they could face it, together. A step forward. A few days later, Grayson pulled up to the apartment complex, his cruiser humming quietly as he parked. He had come to check in on Denise and Tom, but what he didn't expect was to see them standing outside, waiting for him. Tom ran toward him, grinning from ear to ear. "Guess what, Officer Grayson? Mom's taking me to the zoo this weekend." Grayson smiled down at him, his heart light. "That's great, Tom. You two have a great time." Denise approached them, her eyes warm with gratitude. "Thank you for everything, Officer Grayson. You've helped more than you know." Grayson shook his head, his expression humble. "I just did what anyone would do. You both are stronger than you think." Denise smiled, her heart swelling. They were finally on the right path, and it felt like everything was possible again. As Grayson drove away, Denise watched him go. He had been a beacon of hope in their lives when they needed it most. And now, for the first time in a long while, she could see a future full of possibilities, a future she could face with Tom by her side.